Today's topic is a movie that needs no introduction, Disney's John Carter, the breakout hit of 2012. The film that broke records, won over hearts and minds of all moviegoers, and even created world peace. Like many of us, I dream of telling my grandkids that I was there when the world learned about a princess from Mars. So, that's it. That's the whole video. Short little video today. That's all there is to talk about, right? Right?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
Okay, not even close. I'm just going to assume that you probably haven't seen John Carter because not many people have, or even if you have, you probably haven't remembered it. It is one of the biggest box office bombs in film history. We're talking about Waterworld levels of disaster. Maybe that reference is a bit too dated. This was like Mortal Engines, but that reference doesn't even seem relevant either. Better yet, John Carter is the Morbius of 2012.
It's Morbin time.
So definitely one of Disney's biggest missteps. It was a film that lost money on its $300 million budget. And while it might not be a film most moviegoers remember, it is certainly a film that Hollywood remembers, and especially one that Disney remembers, as it helped lead the way to major changes in the film industry, for better or for worse. With all of that said, my name's Josh Taylor, this is Modern Mouse, and today we're going to be talking about Disney's John Carter, the impact that it had on Hollywood at large, and why we should be talking about it more than 10 years later. The film John Carter is based on the pulp novel A Princess from Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and in fact, there are a ton of different John Carter novels that Burroughs wrote. But this film is based on the first novel, A Princess from Mars, and we will be talking about some of the others a little bit later. And you might also be familiar with Burroughs' work, as he was the one that wrote the Tarzan stories, a character that Disney actually had a lot of success with in the animated form, thanks to that Phil Collins soundtrack. Those songs are all bangers. Anyhow, A Princess from Mars, or John Carter as it would become, was sitting in film adaptation limbo for decades. While many filmmakers attribute their love of the pulp series with the books inspiring movies like Star Wars and Avatar, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes problems and shifting ownerships that complicated the making of a film adaptation of these novels. I can't emphasize enough to you that these stories that inspired a ton of different films and filmmakers were constantly being pushed to the side in favor of other stories that would go on to become some of the greatest films that cinema has ever seen. John Carter inspired all of these massive films, so by the time that it was made, the goal was to have it look as epic and grand as all of the movies that came before it, which might explain why the original budget for this relatively obscure pop culture property got to be as wildly high as $250 million. The first try to create an adaptation of these stories came in the 1930s at MGM, featuring longtime Looney Tunes creator Bob Clampett at the helm. Test screenings of the animated film turned MGM off from the idea, and they opted to not continue with the project, despite Universal down the street having success with something similar in the Flash Gordon franchise. In the 1950s, Ray Harryhausen wanted to create a stop-motion animated film with John Carter, and whether or not this would be fully animated or it would be similar to the boundary-pushing Jason and the Argonauts that Harryhausen would go on to make in the 60s is unclear. But if anybody could have done this franchise well in stop-motion, it would have been Harryhausen. He was one of the top sci-fi creators of the mid-20th century, and could have brought prestige to the film just with his name attached to it. In the 1980s, Disney got a hold of the film rights and wanted to create a live-action adaptation to rival Star Wars' popularity. But at that time, the visual effects were not up to the level that Jeffrey Katzenberg and company wanted them to be, so it just sat on the shelf until Paramount Studios picked up the rights in the 2000s. At that point, directors Robert Rodriguez and Jon Favreau were attached. Wanting to do more practical effects than animation or CGI, the directors fought with Paramount to get it made before it was once again nixed in favor of the more financially surefire bet of Star Trek, which relaunched with Chris Pine as its main star, and Favreau would drop out in order to start work on Marvel's Iron Man. Finally, after 80 years, Andrew Stanton, Pixar's director of Finding Nemo and Wall-E, urged Disney to get the rights back to make a film as they were looking for their next big franchise after Pirates of the Caribbean.
Hi, AMC theater fans. I'm Andrew Stanton, the director of John Carter, and I wanted to take a minute to share with you my lifelong passion for this project. You see, my love for Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter novels goes all the way back to my childhood days in Rockport, Massachusetts.
Stanton envisioned a trilogy, with A Princess from Mars being the first film and the other two being Burroughs' second and third books in the series, The Gods of Mars and The Warlord of Mars. Disney had a lack of faith in the project because the John Carter stories weren't really that well known, and there was a lack of stars going into this film, but they did have faith in Andrew Stanton, who was known to turn an unlikely story like Wall-E into a fantastical hit. Keep in mind that while Andrew Stanton is beloved because of his work in animation, he was unproven in the world of live-action filmmaking, especially a big-budget blockbuster film. And he chose to go out of his way to create new stars rather than to pick up A-list celebrities. Essentially, he wanted to do what George Lucas had done with Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher, but instead of Luke and Leia in Star Wars, he was looking for his John Carter and Dejah Thoris, the Princess of Mars.
I could decipher the command. It's a set of sounds. A simple phrase.
Lily Collins was only part of the first season of True Blood and was in no way the main character of that show. And Taylor Kitsch, while being an up-and-coming star at that time thanks to his run on the show Friday Night Lights, was not yet a well-known household name. Stanton thought that the two had chemistry together, which may have come from their familiarity with each other thanks to both starring in the movie X-Men Origins Wolverine, a film we just don't have time to get into, but its poor critical and audience reception didn't really help elevate Kitsch or Collins to megastardom. The fact that Taylor Kitsch played Gambit, a character that many people wanted to see on screen, and he didn't become a big star from that, speaks volumes for what that film did not accomplish. The rest of the cast was filled with bigger players. Bryan Cranston was in the midst of playing Walter White on Breaking Bad at the time of production, making him one of, if not the biggest name in the film. Jon Favreau, Thomas Hayden Church, Samantha Morton, and Willem Dafoe all play native Martians in the film, hiding their voices behind CGI aliens, which, in turn, probably didn't help the film be recognized for its star power, despite plenty of them being involved. The story was also executed in a way that made it difficult to engage the audience. It tries to integrate a way where Burroughs tells the story of John Carter because he knows him and is protecting him. It's a bit convoluted, considering the actual science fiction story itself is a heavy lift for audiences to get on board with. In order to understand the story, we have to learn about how John gets to Mars, or why there's a war between cities on Mars, and the allegory that's at play surrounding Native Americans and their place among a colonized America. Add on top of that a story where Burroughs is protecting John in the late 1800s and is being hunted by aliens. It's probably just too much for most people to handle in a 2-hour film. Andrew Stanton debated with Disney on the idea of John just waking up on Mars, which he considered to be a much more compelling opening. But the studio felt that too much was lost if that approach was taken, so the original overstuffed script was kept. Another wrench to throw into the gears here is that Disney, in particular Bob Iger, had recently purchased Marvel and was looking ahead to expanding on the successful MCU. While John Carter was in production, Iger was also looking to purchase Lucasfilm, specifically mentioning the rights to Star Wars, which became a done deal a few months after the release of Stanton's film. Despite early screenings of John Carter actually doing fairly well, Disney just lost interest, in part because of the purchases that Iger was making for the company, and in part because executives at the studio changed so much about the film. The title of it changed several times for several reasons. The original title, John Carter of Mars, was cut down to just John Carter pretty late in production. A lot of marketing material and posters still had the letters JCM on them at the release, hinting that the of Mars part of the title was cut at the very last second, which is baffling. The Of Mars clued in the audience that this was a science fiction film. The whole title had a Lawrence of Arabia sound to it that hinted at it being an epic story. But because a few too many films like Mars Needs Moms didn't do well, there was this phobia around the word Mars among some of the higher-ups at Disney. Super troubling as well was having the release date moved up from June to March, a time period where films just don't usually do too well. Especially when it's a big budget film like John Carter. The winter months of January through March are usually reserved for smaller budget films with more modest goals. Or movies that are quietly being tucked to the side in favor of other projects. Truly, a summer release with a big marketing budget behind it was the only hope that John Carter had to recoup its big budget. But rather than a normal marketing push for the movie, Stanton, who was in control of the trailers, opted to advertise the film's visuals rather than rely on his own name value, or to talk about the films that John Carter had inspired over the last century. He even opted to do a TED Talk rather than put more effort into real widespread marketing, and while it's easy to point the finger at Stanton, Disney's usual big blockbuster marketing was practically non-existent. There was no merchandising whatsoever, no action figures at toy stores, no YouTube and television commercials to be seen. Disney should have been telling audiences,
"Now this is the plan. Get your ass to Mars."
But instead, they basically just shuffled off this film to die. The film premiered in March of 2012 and lost out in its opening weekend to The Lorax. It came and went quickly enough in theaters that by June of that year, it was already available to purchase or rent to watch at home. To be successful in the eyes of executives, the film would have needed to make at least $600 million to make up for the production costs, the marketing, and so on, even though there was really no marketing to be seen. But the movie would only make half that amount. Collins was told by her manager to just straight up disappear for a while, and Taylor Kitsch never became the big film star that he could have, working on another box office bomb next with the movie Battleship. And Andrew Stanton felt defeated, and the 2 sequels that he wanted to create were cancelled. He ended up getting a phone call from Bob Iger as he returned to Pixar, giving him a pep talk, and while it's nice to hear, it was clear that the studio had not believed in the project, and moving forward, they wouldn't be putting stock in any new big ideas. Despite the casting, the script, the lack of marketing, or the film itself, I think that John Carter was always doomed, and was never going to be the big new franchise for Disney as Hollywood was making serious changes. John Carter was supposed to be the follow-up to Pirates of the Caribbean, or at least it was an attempt to make a big new giant franchise because that one had been so successful throughout the 2000s. But Disney, specifically Bob Iger, was looking to move the company in a completely different direction that nobody was aware of, especially the people working on John Carter as those moves were being made. Iger's purchases of Marvel and Lucasfilm became the priority for the company, rather than trying to create new films or even adapting old, unfamiliar material. And this was to keep up with the changing tides of Hollywood, because big sequel films were dominating the box office, and terms like franchise or intellectual property were becoming a part of the conversations around filmmaking, but that's a different topic for a different video. And let me say something else here, because John Carter was not the first film to fail at the studio around this time, and it wouldn't be the last, but it did change the studio in major ways. Prince of Persia came out in 2010 and starred Jake Gyllenhaal with Pirates producer Jerry Bruckheimer on board. It took elements from the popular video game franchise to create an original film, and while it didn't lose money, it certainly wasn't the next Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm not sure if Prince of Persia's failings bled into Disney executives' decision to not market John Carter, but the 2 films together certainly didn't help projects that would come afterwards. The Lone Ranger, which was set for a 2013 release, had its budget cut significantly thanks to those films, despite Pirates star Johnny Depp being involved in it. And Tomorrowland would also get a smaller budget, and while there were hopes that that film would do well, Disney was firmly putting more effort into new Marvel and Star Wars projects than they ever were with Tomorrowland. John Carter's legacy is really a story about Disney's changing ideals with the choice to bank on surefire safe bets and franchises that had name value recognition, much more than Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories ever did. Thanks to Bob Iger's purchase of Marvel and Lucasfilm, as well as 20th Century down the line, the studio would pivot to creating less original big-budget films and base their live-action movies in worlds that audiences were already familiar with. Something that much of Hollywood has been trying to duplicate, with Warner Brothers turning to DC Comics and the wizarding world of Harry Potter over and over again, or Universal continuing to make Fast and Furious films and Jurassic Park sequels. In no way do I want to put the blame on anyone in particular here. While Andrew Stanton was a novice as a live-action director, he did go on to direct and write Finding Dory, a sequel to Finding Nemo which became the top-earning film of 2016. And Bob Iger tends to be seen as a success story for the Disney company, and the purchases that he made continue to be billion-dollar franchises. In no way can I fault either man here. Hollywood has always gone through changes for a number of reasons. John Carter's failure was the catalyst for change in the same ways that The Wizard of Oz's success in 1939 turned Hollywood into an industry striving for more fantasy than realism. It's only a matter of time before the next major shift in filmmaking takes place. Whether that's because of audience reactions or because the studios opt to force those changes is somewhat of a chicken or egg dilemma. Regardless, John Carter's legacy should not be looked at as purely negative here. Yes, it did make it harder for an original film to come out of a major studio, but often the films that break out unexpectedly become the catalyst for change within the industry. A film like Star Wars, which was supposed to be a failure, ended up becoming one of the biggest franchises in all of science fiction history, and so much so that Disney opted to purchase it for billions of dollars. Marvel Comics almost went under, and now the MCU is so big that it's practically its own genre. You can call it sabotage from within, or changing priorities, or maybe it was a film doomed from the beginning. But John Carter should be a reminder that seasons are always changing, and evolution is not without its victims. Thanks for watching. You can watch another video from me here, and as always, my friends, keep moving forward. Wait, sorry. Hello?